Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for some more H.P. Lovecraft. Yes, your weekly Lovecraft. This week we are going to be talking about The Festival, an often overlooked story, I believe published in 1925. Despite the fact that it's often overlooked, I think it's really worth looking at even if you haven't read a lot of Lovecraft for a couple of reasons. First of all, the execution of the story is both unique and very effective, and it's very well done, and there's a couple of things that he does in it that are worth noting. Second of all, I think it's worth looking at because of the way it fits into the broader context and style that he employs throughout his other works. And lastly, I think it's also worth looking at because of the influence that this particular story has had on the horror genre and on some specific authors. I'm going to talk about Stephen King with that because he wrote a couple of short stories that are very closely related to this one that I'll talk about towards the end of the video. So the transfer of influence, the transfer of ideas to that later generation marks this particular story as worthy of study. So first of all, with the execution, there's a couple of things that he does that enhance the effectiveness of this particular story. One thing that we should note is that it's a fairly short story. So I think it's about 3,000 words, which is pretty short for H.P. Lovecraft. He usually takes a few more words to tell his story, but he's always been a pretty efficient storyteller. One of the reasons this story is so efficient is it lacks dialogue. Now, dialogue is one of the main ways that you tell a story usually, and this is because most of our information out in the real world is processed and transferred via dialogue. We talk to another person. And so when we're experiencing stories, we tend to like to see a lot of the information put out as dialogue. When people talk about telling versus showing, showing is usually dialogue and action, whereas telling is just telling the audience what they need to know. Well, when you get rid of dialogue, you're able to just tell the audience, and it's actually more efficient. So telling a story entirely through prose ends up being a much more efficient experience per word, per line, than having a bunch of dialogue. When you have a bunch of dialogue, you really have to be careful how you're going to show the elements that you're trying to show to the audience. When you just tell them, you can tell them exactly what they need to know and the exact order that you want them to process it in. And another sort of side effect of not having any dialogue, besides the fact that it's efficient, is that it enhances the mood of the story. The narrator, it's told in a first-person perspective, which also happens to be pretty efficient. He's traveling to Kingsport. He's traveling to this old town, and he's describing everything in the past tense, but none of the other characters talk. There's no one else talking to him, and there's no dialogue until you get to the very last part where there's like some quotes. So because nobody's talking to him, it brings up the eeriness of it. It's something unexpected. We're used to, even in short stories, having dialogue, having people speak. So having nobody speak makes the story itself a little bit creepier. It's an interesting point of execution. Another thing that's worth noting is the way that Lovecraft describes things. And I've talked about this in some other places, but I'll talk about it here now because there's some great examples in here. When he describes something, rather than being really specific with what he wants you to visualize, like, the back slowly transitioned from feathers into skin. He says it's indescribable, but then proceeds to tell you a bunch of things that might be, it couldn't be said to be a crow or a bat or a vampire bat. So at one point in the story, he's describing these winged beasts. And the way he describes them, he says, no sane person could remember the details. It's impossible to describe. It wasn't a crow. It wasn't a bat. It wasn't a vampire bat. It wasn't he said like a rotting corpse or a decayed corpse. So he gives you some images, and essentially you combine those things to produce the horrific image rather than him trying to use a bunch of words to describe it accurately. This is effective for two reasons. First of all, it's kind of efficient to just say, here's some animals, combine them in your head. That's what he's doing, though you really wouldn't be aware of it as a reader in most cases. That tends to be more efficient, but also it tends to be more effective because the image that you create in your mind to try to rectify these things which don't fit together, a crow and a bat and a rotting corpse, those things are going to combine in a way that's going to produce a horrific image in your mind. So he gets your mind to work on the puzzle of what it's going to look like, and that can create a disturbing effect as well. And indeed, I think it's very effective the way he describes the winged beasts, but also the way he describes people. He keeps saying they have almost a waxen appearance or a wax mask, and that's important because one of the things he does in the climax of the story, if you will, is he avoids describing what's underneath the face. So all of these people in this town have a strange facial appearance, and none of them speak. So that's very, very, very off-putting. It's very creepy. And then finally, a mask slips. We don't know what's underneath it. But what we see is the consequence of that. We see the narrator jump into the water to escape from whatever is underneath the mask of this horrible person. So we know that it's something that's just completely awful. We have some expression of noises or something writhing, something worm-like, and then finally in the last quote we end up with some references to worms to give you the idea that there's something wriggling and crawling. There's a mass of things behind the face that are not human, that you're going to just think of all of those things. He avoids just saying, oh, well, the mask slipped and he saw a bunch of wriggling worms, right? He just doesn't show that to you, and you kind of allude to that. You create a stronger image than what you would have created had you just been told that there were writhing worms underneath the mask. So all those things are really done well. Lastly, or I should say next, because lastly we'll talk about the influence. Next, I think it's important to look at the story in the broader context of H.P. Lovecraft and some of the things he does. This is a story that has a strong descent into madness. You've heard me talk about the descent into madness, where things are replaced from normal and understandable to surreal one element at a time until you are completely in the world of fantastical or horrific elements. This story does it really well, and it does it very efficiently. He's cresting a hill and he sees an ancient town. And one of the things he says is, I heard the trolleys went there, but this town was ancient. There were no trolleys there. So right away, you feel like you've taken a step out of the modern and into the pre-modern. And all the roofs are old style. Everything looks like it's several hundred years old, and it's like a New England town. So one of the things that he does in a lot of his stories is have these ancient New England towns. And people who've never been there don't realize that there's a lot of old houses there that sometimes have a creepy look. People had been settling it since the 1600s, and it still has a lot of empty space in it. So it's a natural setting. It's one of the reasons Stephen King, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, one of the reasons he set so many stories in Maine, not just because he lives there, but because it tends to be a rather creepy place. Anyway, so you have this town, things are slowly replaced. He goes into a house that he's been directed to go into. The person answers the door and doesn't speak. There's a woman working a spinning wheel, doesn't speak. It's candlelit, no electric lights, no gas lights. So it's candlelight, which itself is pulling you further into the pre-modern. There's strange books on the table. The narrator gets a little curious and ends up reading the Necronomicon, which is a book that course fits into the broader context of Lovecraft. And not only is he horrified by what's in it, but when the host from the house comes down, that's the book the host takes with him out the door when he leads him out the door. Then they put on things like hoods. He says he has an ancient outfit, which can mean almost anything. But when you think of an ancient outfit, you're probably thinking of something from the 1700s, some sort of old Puritan outfit. And so he takes you to this church, and when you get to the church, things are weird. People are there at candlelight, nobody's talking. A trapdoor opens in the church, and they go down the trapdoor into a cavern where there's an oily ocean, and then these winged beasts come. So by the time the winged beasts get there, you've replaced one element at a time from modern, understandable, safe, into something horrific and fantastical. And now what's interesting about this story is that usually with the descent into madness, there's a point where the character has to decide, do I embrace the madness and go forward, or do I turn back, and how do I turn back? So in several of the stories, the character will get to a threshold and will turn back, or will get to a threshold and cross over it. And in some cases, you only know they've crossed over it because of some other element in the story. And we'll get that when we talk about Call of Cthulhu. But the Unnamed City is one where he gets to the end, and finally he understands that the residents of the city were the these ghosts of these alligator people. He doesn't really have an opportunity to step over the madness until he realizes and recontextualizes everything that he's seen. In this case, there's, these people are beckoning him to get on this winged beast and fly off into the darkness. But he has a moment of revelation when this mask slips. He's so horrified he jumps into the water. And he jumps into the water. I think it's an important moment when the narrator jumps into the water, because when you're jumping into the water of the cavern of darkness, it's basically like you're embracing death. You're committing suicide rather than take another step forward into this evil madness. Then when the character wakes up, they tell him that he was never at the town to begin with. So this has another element that you get sometimes with H.P. Lovecraft, which is an unreliable narrator. A narrator that you start to doubt whether he's told the truth or whether he is insane. That's part of the descent into madness, is you start to doubt the words of the narrator being true. You start to doubt what you know to be true. And so he accomplishes this in a very efficient manner by having the narrator wake up in a hospital and essentially have the doctors think he's suffering from psychosis, and they had drug him out of this freezing water. He had fallen off a cliff, and the town never really existed. But he manages to convince them to find a copy of the Necronomicon, and in it he sees the passages that he recognizes reading at this strange town. And so he knows on some level that it probably wasn't a hallucination, that was actually there, but there's something more sinister and horrific going there that we never find out. And this is another thing to talk about with horror, is not resolving all of the conflict, not telling you all of the secrets, leaving the secrets out there to be discovered later or to be never understood, has a very good effect, I think. It makes people feel creepy and makes their mind start to work, which makes, in general, a more effective story. Last thing to talk about, besides the context and the execution of this particular book, is its influence on the genre in general. There are two Stephen King stories that I want to point you to, both of which can be found in the collection called Night Shift. In fact, I think they're the first couple stories off of Night Shift. One of them is called Graveyard Shift, and one of them is called Jerusalem's Lot, not to be confused with Salem's Lot, his vampire novel. But they're both named after the same place, which is called Jerusalem's Lot. So in Jerusalem's Lot, again, it's like an old, New England house. It's creepy. You go into a basement. The basement has some creepy stuff in it. They go and they find a church in this abandoned town. Where did all the people go? This reference to like my ancestor who was like the king of worms. All of that stuff is very, very close. It's like a takeoff of the festival, but it's kind of done in Stephen King's own unique way. Now, rather than him doing it in this exact way of just having a first-person narrator tell it, he does it through letters in the way that H.P. Lovecraft executes things like Call of Cthulhu. So it's several different first-person accounts that construct that particular story. The other story is called Graveyard Shift. It takes place in the modern period, like at a paper mill. And there's a couple of guys that are working there, and they're tasked with cleaning out parts of the mill in the basement. And as they go further down into the basement, they go to like one basement, then another basement, then another basement. And by the time they get to the bottom, you basically have these blind white bat-winged creatures that are like almost exactly like the creatures out of the festival, attacking them and killing them. And that one's told in a third-person perspective, so you are essentially allowed to have the narrators or the main characters, the protagonists, die in that particular story. Spoiler alert. It's not that long a story, so hopefully the spoilers won't bother you. But I do recommend both those stories. They're pretty well executed Stephen King fare, and both of them are in some ways variations of what you see in Festival. And so as we look at lots of horror, particularly short horror, that's there to evoke the feelings in maybe a single scene and contain this descent into madness. Again, the descent into madness in the Festival, you were literally going down into the earth by the end of it. And of course, in Stephen King's stories that I think are somewhat, inspired by this. In Graveyard Shift, you're physically going down further and further into deeper basements where things get stranger. The rats are finally replaced by monsters towards the end, and And that makes for a very effective story, I think. Likewise, with Jerusalem's Lot, you are slowly getting towards what the insanity is. And again, the reference to worms and things like that is present. Let me read you one little quote from this particular story. I could do like an audiobook or something for you free, because this is a pretty short one, if you want me to read that. This is where the narrator has acquired the Necronomicon. So I read again that hideous chapter and shuddered doubly, because it was indeed not new to me. I had seen it before, let footprints tell what they might, and where it was I had seen, it was best forgotten. There was no one in waking hours who could remind me of it, but my dreams are filled with terror because of phrases I dare not quote. I dare quote only one paragraph put into such English as I can make from the awkward low Latin. The nethermost caverns, wrote the mad Arab, are not for the fathoming of eyes that see, for their marvels are strange and terrific. Cursed the ground where dead thoughts live new and oddly bodied, and evil the mind that is held by no head. Wisely did Ibn Shakabo say that happy is the tomb where no wizard hath lain, and happy the town at night whose wizards are all ashes. For it is of old rumor that the soul of the devil-bought hastes not from this charnel clay, but fats and instructs the very worm that gnaws, till out of corruption horrid life springs, and the dull scavengers of earth wax crafty to vex it, and swell monstrous to plague it. Great holes secretly are digged where earth's pores ought to suffice, and things have learnt to walk that ought to crawl. So in that passage, he finally puts it all together for you. And rather than telling you directly what was inhabiting this town, he lets you think about it and construct it. And I'll lay it out for you. So what he's saying there is that the worms that have eaten his ancestors who were wizards, he mentions that several of his ancestors were hanged for being witches. He meets a character that is pointing to his face as though he's his great-great-great-great-grandfather who died in like 1698. He goes, I know it couldn't be him because he died in 1698, but the effects he had were his. But my great-great-grandfather was buried with the things that he was holding. So basically all of the people are worms that have been magically infused with the mind of these undying people. So that, where he says, oddly bodied and evil the mind that is held by no head. So essentially these people have been reconstructed out of things such as worms, and that is the horror of it. So at the end of the story, you get an absolutely horrific realization about what he's experienced, and he puts it all together. So it's a great little story. Of course, you can read it for free because most Lovecraft is in, I think all of it actually is in the public domain, so you can look it up online and read it. It's a good little story. It doesn't take a lot of time to read, but it's very, very well executed and has had a lot of influence, I think, and certainly influenced me. So you can find my books at dvspress.com or read more about them at davidvstewart.com, either one. You can join my mailing list, dvspress.com/list, and you can get my newest little mini book, which is called Voices of the Void. It is a sci-fi horror book. Maybe let's call it Lovecraft meets aliens or something like that. It has its own flavor. Hopefully you will like it, and if horror's not your thing, that's okay too. But if you hop on the list, you'll probably get at least one other free book for you guys. So have a great one, and I'll see you guys next time.